Next, we had the last of our major panels for the symposium. This one is convened by our colleagues at UC Santa Cruz. As temperatures, pollution, and sea levels rise, ensuring the health of the oceans is an immediate challenge. Please welcome Radhika Malpani, who will moderate the panel on Ocean Innovation, Tech Interventions for the Health of Our Global Waters. Radhika also has a great story. She comes to us from the tech world, including 20 years at Google, where among her roles, she founded Google Images and took it to over 1 billion queries a day. Her passion for the oceans, as well as concern over the climate, led her to co-create Hacking for Oceans, a class that teaches entrepreneurship to address problems critical to the oceans. Over to you, Radhika.
Thank you, Camille. So I am really excited to introduce you to our fabulous panelists. We have Anne Kapuscinski from UC Santa Cruz, Mariana Biff from Mbari, and Kelley Ruehl from Sandia Labs.
So let's start with Anne. Anne is the director of the Coastal Science and Policy Program, and she's a professor of environmental studies at UC Santa Cruz. She's a world-renowned expert on fisheries conservation and sustainable aquaculture, and is a recipient of the Pew Marine Conservation Fellowship, and is also the first woman to chair the board of directors of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Anne, could you tell us a little bit about how you got here?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to do that, Radhika, and thank you for introducing me. I guess the short version of how I got here is after my family immigrated to the United States, I spent most of my childhood on the North Shore of Long Island, growing up on Long Island Sound. Started sailing at a very early age and spent all my spare time either sailing or hanging out the beach swimming. And that led me to really falling in love with fish and other marine organisms living in the ocean. The first report I did in 4th grade was actually on whales. So I fell in love with marine biology, and when I went to college, I majored in biology. And when I was on an exchange program at Pomona College, I went to college at Swarthmore, I took a seminar that really could have changed my life. Back then it was called Man's Impact on the Environment. We now know we should call it Humans' Impact or People's Impact on the Environment. But from that course, I learned, this was back in the 70s. There are already dramatic impacts, harmful impacts on the marine environment from all kinds of human activities. And I also learned that many people around the world's lives and well-being, their food and other kinds of economic activity depend on the ocean, on a healthy ocean. So I committed that I wanted to learn more about how could we actually take better care of our ocean environments in ways that would benefit people and the environment. I didn't really want to believe the classic economic argument that there's always trade-offs. Yes, indeed, there are trade-offs, but I really wanted to believe that we could come up with solutions that would have synergies where you could actually make things better for people as well as for the environment. So that led me to graduate studies in fisheries, my first faculty job at University of Minnesota in Fisheries and Wildlife Department, focused on aquaculture research, and I was doing conservation genetics back then. Long story short, eventually I really discovered the really important arena of sustainability, which is actually one of the places where people are trying to reach those synergies. And that naturally led me to getting interested in also innovation. And as my career progressed, I kind of honed it more and more to really wanting to have my research and my teaching and my mentoring focusing on practical solutions that are scientifically informed, but that are scalable and that will really move the needle forward, especially now that we're running out of time to take good care of our oceans.
Thank you, Anne. Talking about practical solutions, you are one of the world's experts on sustainable aquaculture. Can you talk a little bit more about the work you're doing out there?
Yes, I'd be glad to do that. I have the honor of co-leading an ecological aquaculture research lab with my partner, my colleague from Bangladesh, Dr. Palab Sarkar. And I first recruited him when I was at Dartmouth before coming to UC Santa Cruz because he was an expert on sustainable fish nutrition. And we decided to work on how to transform the feeds that are fed to farmed fish so that they would be more sustainable. And the reason we decided to focus on feeds is other work that had done life cycle assessment, looking at environmental impacts due to inputs into aquaculture and emissions from aquaculture, had shown that feeds were one of the biggest sources of environmental problems, including carbon emissions, eutrophication pollution, and extracting too much of the small fish found in pelagic zones. We refer to them as forage fisheries, things such as sardines, anchovies, mackerel, and herring, extracting way too much of them to make fish meal and fish oil that then get used in aquaculture diets. And that's causing an impact on the biodiversity in the oceans. It turns out that in some places, there are some relatively sustainable fisheries, for example, off the coast of Peru, but even there, especially with climate change, we're seeing more and more volatility in what's kind of the natural up and down cycle of the yields of those fisheries. And there's a hunger for finding sort of alternative sources of the really nutritious protein and the oils. You have other places in the world like Liberia and about 30 other countries in the global south where you have low income communities and coastal zones who's have depended on these forage fisheries, such as sardines, for accessible, affordable, really nutritious and culturally important food source. But they're now losing access to that because so much of those fish are getting sucked off to go into these big capture industrial fisheries. And if you look at the global use of fish meal and fish oil, they are both big commodities now. Approximately 90% of them are going now into, I think the number is now 75% are going into making feeds for aquaculture. So we're essentially grinding up some fish to feed other fish. There are also, and then there are these human health and these sort of social justice concerns. So my team decided to explore alternative ingredients, and we focused on marine microalgae for a number of reasons. I'll just give one reason now, which is that on the planet, marine microalgae are the planet's main producer of omega-3 fatty acids, which are those really healthy fatty acids. There also was this industry that had started growing microalgae initially for fossil fuels, to replace fossil fuels. They had reached a point where they realized they couldn't really cost compete with fossil fuels, at least not at that time. And they were looking for alternative markets. And just about that time, my lab was gearing up and saying, look, if we looked at the science, we could see that the nutritional content of these marine microalgae were almost perfect for meeting the amino acid needs of the fish. They were high in energy, and they had these omega-3 fatty acids. So to make a long story short, after playing around with different microalgae and deciding to really focus on the ones that either were already commercially produced at commercial levels, such as this one algae very high in one of the omega-3 fatty acids called CITRIS, or focusing also on marine microalgae that are being produced by companies like one of our partners is Qualitas Health. It's being produced in ponds on land to extract the EPA-rich oil to put into human supplements, in human capsules, essentially instead of fish oil capsules. But then the company's left with this waste, which is still protein-rich cells. And they partnered with us to let us use that so-called waste or byproduct. And we figured out that it meets the protein needs of a number of fish. So we focused initially with tilapia because they're the world's second most farmed fish. And in nature, they already feed part of their diet on microalgae. So we figured this would be good proof of concept. And after 5 or 6 years of work, in November 2020, we published a really major paper in a Nature journal, Scientific Reports, where we found that by combining the CITRIS and this leftover biomass that had been thought of as a waste from Nanochoropsis into the diet, we could replace all of the fish meal and the fish oil, and we got better growth of the fish, better food conversion. We had a cost-viable diet, and also the fish flesh was better for human nutrition because it had elevated levels of one of the omega-3 fatty acids, DHA. Our lab is now trying to do the same thing with trout, and we're using rainbow trout both as a model for salmon, because farm salmon is one of the highest valued sectors of global aquaculture, and also salmon and trout require a lot more of this omega-3 fatty acids in their diet, also more fish ingredients normally in their diet, because in nature they feed on fish. We are partway through that work we have 3 grants right now supporting that work from USDA and from Sea Grant. And we don't have the results yet to fully report it, but we just finished a growth experiment where our raw data looked really promising. So we think that we can at least reduce the total amount of fish meal and fish oil, and maybe we'll be able to replace it by these unique combinations of marine macroalgae. We also do some manipulations to just do a little bit of enzymatic treatment to kind of make some of the ingredients more digestible.
Thank you, Erin.
Let me just say a little bit about the aquafeed tool. There's so much activity going on in the sector right now to find alternative ingredients for fish meal and fish oil. We have companies, some of which are started here in Silicon Valley, that are using things such as methanogenomic bacteria, yeast, insect meals, to also replace fish meal and fish oil. But there isn't a kind of standard tool and also open access tool for people to kind of compare what really are the environmental and the economic implications of using these different ingredients in diets to end up with fish-free diets. So our team is developing what will be the world's first sustainable aquafeed decision support tool. And it combines the ability to assess economic impacts, do techno-economic analysis, and also look at some of these performance metrics, such as food conversion that the aquafeed companies care about. And we are almost done with the software, and we'll be soon releasing a beta version for the community to review and test. And we're working with a number of industry partners who have been giving us technical advice to make sure that our estimates are commercially relevant for the data that we put into the tool. And it'll be a tool that will be open access so that people can continue to improve it and add many other ingredients to it as this very fast moving arena continues to develop.
That sounds great. I look forward to both your work and the rest of the community in eliminating forage fish from fish food. That would be fantastic. Let me move on to our second panelist, Mariana Biff. Mariana is part of the chemical sensors group at MBARI. MBARI is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, and she works with biogeochemical floats. She's an oceanographer, specialized in biogeochemistry, and has participated on numerous long scientific cruises from the North Pacific all the way down to Antarctica. Now, in her research, she combines data from oceanographic cruises with the global data set that has been generated from floats. And she does this to basically understand the cycle of nutrients and carbon in the ocean. And also to estimate ocean productivity and carbon export. And this is basically the process that regulates the Earth's climate. Mariana, tell me a little bit, how did you get here?
Hi, Radhika. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm very excited to be here with these wonderful women. And so how I got here, since I was a kid, I wanted to be a scientist. So I would find myself immersed in books and encyclopedias, trying to understand what were the species that were living in the oceans. So when I grew up, it was a no-brainer for me that I wanted to be an oceanographer. So I did my bachelor's in oceanography in Brazil. It's a little bit different path there because you can't really choose your major toward the end. You need to choose your major before you enroll in university. So I enrolled in oceanography. I participated on a lot of research during my undergrad, since my second year of undergrad. And I worked a lot with harmful algae blooms. So analyzing their toxins, I always lean more toward the chemistry side of things. So analyzing their toxins and then looking at the impact of these toxins to marine populations, more to the coastal ocean. And then my interest leaned more towards the open ocean and the big picture. So I did my master's in chemical and physical oceanography, also trying to understand on the impact of a harmful algae more in the open ocean. And then this made me fall in love with biogeochemistry, which is basically trying to explain how the different elements cycle in the globe, and not only in the ocean, but what is the connection between land and ocean, because we know everything is connected on Earth.
Right.
And I also wanted to have a different perspective of what science is like outside of my country. Unfortunately, my country is very underfunded in terms of science. So I came to United States to do my PhD at the University of Miami, and work with my advisor, which was one of the biggest one of the biggest blessings. So I studied organic carbon cycling in the ocean, and basically trying to understand why does carbon resist remineralization through microbes and just last in the ocean. And while I was doing research in the Northeast Pacific, I was from the East Coast, but doing research in the West Coast, I came across this technology that I work on right now, and I was just stumbled with the amount of data that we had. So I combined results from Cruz data with float data.
Right.
And basically it was a no turn back. When I finished my PhD, I talked with my current supervisor, the principal scientist of my lab, and I got a fellowship to be a postdoc in the lab. And then I just stayed as a permanent position right now.
So I'd like to hear a little bit about that work. I mean, we all know the ocean covers 70% of the surface. It generates half our oxygen, absorbs more than a quarter of the carbon dioxide we emit. But still, it feels like we know very little about it. And I know the work that you're doing, you're working to change that. You're working to change our understanding of the ocean. Can you tell our audience a little bit more, both about the Argo system and your specific work?
Yes. So to try to understand the ocean is the same as when we try to understand the land, we need to go and sample. But it's a little bit more difficult to go to the ocean, especially at the different seasons. So we use, in the past, we used a lot of cruises. So we go on cruises and we sample as much as we can to try to have a representation of the ocean that is as true as possible. But some regions are very difficult to reach. And for example, if you go to the Southern Ocean in the winter, how are you going to sample there? That's why the Argo program was created. So the Argo program is an international effort, and it has a big contribution from the United States. So basically, they put robots in the water that have sensors that measure temperature and salinity. This has been going on for a few decades right now. And thanks to these robots that sample very high temporal and very high resolution, we are able to reconstruct the ocean's interior, and we basically see that the ocean is warming and becoming more stratified, and some currents are slowing down. But to understand the ocean's health, we need a little bit more than temperature and salinity. We also need some chemical variables such as pigments, particulate organic carbon, and oxygen, and pH measurements. And that's why we have been creating chemical sensors to be adapted to these floats and release them all over the world. So my lab is responsible for developing and calibrating and putting the sensors on these floats, transforming them into biogeochemical floats. So we have two very big projects, and they are all funded through NSF. One is SOCOM, which is the oldest project. And so we put a lot of these floats in the Southern Ocean. And thanks to these floats, now we know that the Southern Ocean, for example, is becoming saltier, more deoxygenated than it was. Another big project that was recently funded about 2 years ago is the biggest funded project in oceanography through National Science Foundation. It's a $53 million project. It's called GoBGC, which is funded to release 500 of these floats in the global ocean. So we have some floats that have been already there for like 15, 20 years, thanks to independent projects and international efforts. And now we have the GoBGC that is putting more and more floats over there. So we are able to see the very complete picture to understand now, and then we can understand what's going on later.
I can't wait to see the data and what scientists do with that. But we've already had some interesting learnings, right? In the Blob of 2013, from what I remember, there were a few Argo floats in the arena before, during, and after. So you learned a lot at that time. Can you talk a little bit more about what the learnings were? What did it tell scientists about the impact of climate and how we could, on the oceans, and how we could maybe possibly deal with it, mitigate it?
Yeah, so this Blob event was basically a giant marine heat wave that happened in the Pacific Ocean from 2013 to 2015. And we actually had a second one in 2018, which I'm studying right now, the second one. So basically this started in the atmosphere. And this is when we go back to, we don't live in an island, we live in a world, and there is a very big connection. So this warm event started in the atmosphere here in the West Coast, and it propagated to the ocean. Basically, this anomaly in the atmosphere prevented the ocean to cool during the winter. And as a result, because during the winter, the water cools and brings nutrients to the phytoplankton to produce carbon, produce biomass that goes up to the food web. Because of that warm event, the ocean got prevented from this nutrient renewal, which brought to a crash in primary productivity or production of carbon during those warm years. Well, this passes through the entire food web. So if you have a crash in phytoplankton production, have a crash in zooplankton, you have a crash in fisheries, in whales, in birds that will feed from these fisheries. Also, we had a negative effect of that warm event, not only the production, but because of the raised temperatures, some fisheries, they migrated to other regions. So when the whales went there to feed, or when the birds went there to feed, there was nothing there. It caused mass mortality of organisms because they couldn't keep up with the warm waters. And this lasted a very long time because, again, this happened in the west coast of United States, but it was connected to an El Nino that happened in the equatorial Pacific. And this made this warm weather last for 2 years in a row because of this big El Nino. So again, what happens in the southern hemisphere can cause a feedback on the northern hemisphere.
I'm going to come back and ask all of you about what impacts you see on climate change in the oceans. But first, I'd like to welcome our third and final panelist, Kelley Ruehl. So Kelley is an R&D mechanical engineer. She works on ocean renewable energy at Sandia National Labs. Her research is focused on numerical modeling of ocean wave energy devices. And she has worked in developing an open source software for marine energy applications. She's the principal investigator of the Wave Energy Converter Simulator, which is open source software that's used to model the dynamic response of wave energy converters. That software is a 2021 R&D 100 award winner, and it's used internationally by developers and researchers. Kelley, can you tell us a little bit about how you came here?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. When thinking about how I got here, it was hard to think about where to even begin, right? So I think I'll start in high school, in elementary school. I was always passionate about math and science, and those were subjects that I always excelled in and really enjoyed. And I was fortunate enough in my high school to have an opportunity to take an introduction to engineering class. I grew up in Ohio, and it was through Ohio State that I took that class. I really enjoyed it, and that's what really drove me to study engineering as an undergrad. I applied to a bunch of different places, ended up choosing Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, which is a teaching school. It's an undergraduate teaching school that really focuses on undergraduate education. And so I studied there. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do next. So many of my peers were, going directly to professional tracks. That didn't appeal to me so much. And fortunately, during that time, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Germany. So I studied at the University of Stuttgart, and I had a split between actually studying there and doing an internship, which was really enjoyable. But during that time, I traveled quite a bit, and I had the opportunity to see a lot of installed wind turbines and rooftop solar and all kinds of renewable energy that at the time, that's the early 2000s, installed renewable energy in the US just wasn't nearly to the installed capacity that we see now. And so I wondered, driving around, riding around on trains and seeing wind farms and solar farms, why I didn't see that in the US. And that really drove me to want to study renewable energy for my graduate work. So I talked to an advisor, and they kind of told me, why don't you do some research? So I also had the opportunity to do an undergraduate student research program at NASA when I was a student, and I really enjoyed the research. So I kind of put all that together and decided to go to graduate school to study renewable energy. But that's still a big field. So, you know, what area of renewable energy? I spent a lot of my time looking into different renewable technologies and got really excited about marine renewable energy. So I applied to universities that did research in that field and ended up at Oregon State, where they have a national center for marine renewable energy, specifically ocean energy. So that's what I did my graduate work in. I gave a talk at a conference while I was doing my graduate work on my research, and was approached by a Sandia Labs employee who recruited me for an internship because they were funded to do similar work on wave energy. So I took the internship, had that really pivotal decision in graduate school about whether to continue to pursue my PhD or whether to work. Found out I was really enjoying working. And so I started at Sandia right after my master's, and I've been here for just about 10 years now.
Interesting. That's pretty much the same decision I made.
Yeah.
Was I found I really enjoyed my internship. I didn't want to continue with my PhD.
It's a tough decision that so many people
It's a tough
have to
one. I agree, because
Yeah.
So can you give our audience just maybe a quick landscape on the marine renewable energy space and how your work fits in there?
Yes, certainly. So marine renewable energy consists of a bunch of different renewable energy technologies. Broadly, that's ocean wave energy, current energy, which includes both tidal, ocean, and river currents. There's also ocean thermal energy conversion technologies, salinity gradient. Those all kind of fit within the marine renewable energy landscape. My focus is primarily on ocean wave energy. And as a Sandia Labs employee, a national laboratory employee, our role is a bit of a bridge, I'd say, between industry and academia. We do a bunch of fundamental research and development, but we also do a lot of applied work. So we're kind of in the middle between industry and academia. And we're meant to be provided this enabling role. So that's where a lot of my work on open source software development falls in. Is we don't work on advancing a specific technology. We work on reducing the barrier of entry and accelerating technology development for the industry as a whole. And open source software fits nicely within that, because we can provide tools that are applicable for the entire community that can then be customized for a specific technology. And that's a lot of what I do, especially the WEXIM project. It's an open source modeling tool for modeling wave energy converters. It can be applied to any wave energy technology. And due to the licensing structure that we chose, it can also be privatized and customized by a specific developer and retained as their IP.
So can you talk a little bit more about where we are with commercialization of wave energy? Like, what are the obstacles? When we had talked, you had mentioned something about, taking into account the costs of not doing anything. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly. So when I think about where we are with marine renewable energy in general, and ocean wave energy fits within that, we commonly say that we're about 30 years behind where wind energy was. So this was surprising to me. So I assume it's going to be new information to the attendees, but I didn't know that wind energy did not start out as when we think of a wind turbine now, we think of a 3-bladed horizontal axis wind turbine. That's not how it started. In the 70s and 80s, I could look it up online, or I can send some links of all of the different innovative technologies that were out there in terms of concepts to extract wind energy. Now we've really, honed in on that design paradigm, that 3-bladed horizontal axis wind turbine. But wave energy and marine energy is kind of where wind was 30 years ago, where we have a vast array of technologies to extract energy, and there isn't a winner. And I think something that's going to be different about wind versus ocean energy and wave energy is that different devices are really better for different regions of the ocean: deep water, shallow water, different sediment types, for foundation systems. So I don't think that we're ever going to have one, quote unquote, design paradigm when it comes to wave energy. I think we're going to have many that are suited for different resources and locations.
Right, right. So what's interesting to me is listening to all three of you talk, all three of you are doing a chunk of work in enabling the system, right? You with your wave energy simulator and with her database for evaluating different types of fish feeds, Mariana with collecting this global database of ocean data that others can then use to further develop their work. So I'm curious, other than your own work, what technologies or projects do you feel are the most promising in addressing ocean health or in mitigating climate change? And it's addressed to all three of you. Take anyone, go for it.
I mean, I can start. I mean, from an energy perspective, one of the big impacts on climate change is the use of fossil fuels. So transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable technologies is a really important measure to improving our climate health. And in terms of that, long-term impact, I think one of the things that's a barrier to new energy technologies, new renewable technologies, is all projects have to go through an environmental impact assessment before they can, be deployed or go to commercialization. And so I think long-term, we need to think about not just how do they change the current environment, but what would be the long-term impact if we didn't make that transition away from fossil fuels.
Mariana, Anne?
I can tell from my perspective that a very good technology is the use of modeling to predict different scenarios that we would be facing. And these models, they need data, they need observations. But since we are collecting more and more and more observation, these models are becoming more robust right now, and they are predicting way better than they used to predict in the past. So I think this is a very powerful tool that we can use. We don't generate any waste in the ocean by trying to model things. So I think it's an amazing technology. And also the use of satellites to observe the Earth and collect data, all kinds of data from the Earth's surface. I think satellite is a very amazing technology for science.
Anne, other than your work,
Right.
what else do you think is highly promising?
Well, I would kind of agree with, what both of them said is valuable, but I think that this, the ability to do this global scale remote sensing of all kinds of things happening in the planet, including in the oceans, is extremely powerful. And it's powerful even in the area of trying to assure that we actually have sustainable and not harmful fishing activities. So for example, the kind of work that Global Fishing Watch is doing, where they can actually track fishing vessels, individually and figure out whether they're actually, illegally fishing on sharks or some other kinds of things. So I think that's extremely valuable. And we're starting to actually see the use of sensors also in this. There's a whole field to try to develop more aquaculture in marine waters because of a sense that the oceans are a place where we can essentially not displace food production on land and grow food in the oceans. But there's, of course, a lot of concern about that some of the traditional ways of doing aquaculture could actually exacerbate harms to the ocean, which is the work that my group is doing. But sensors can be extremely helpful there. So, for example, the marine net pen industry already a number of years ago started putting in underwater cameras that can actually detect when a pellet goes by that didn't get eaten by fish, and then they know that they should stop their automatic feeders. I think we're going to see more of that kind of thing, and it's going to be really important for essentially both watchdogging that aquaculture develops in a sustainable way, and to actually help the enterprises that invest and execute it to make sure that they're doing it in a cost-effective way for their own bottom line.
Right. So since this is a diversity symposium and we have only 5 minutes left, I'm going to ask all three of you, why is it important to aim for diversity and inclusion? What approaches have you taken to elevate others? And what has your experience been, both as a woman and some of your immigrants? It's open to all three of you.
I'd be glad to start, since it's really a really big passion of mine. I think that the most important answer to why is it important to do this is, my goodness, we have all this diversity in humanity. Why don't we should be rushing to embrace as much of that diversity as possible, to bring all the different perspectives, the talent, the different kinds of creativity, the different starting points because of different cultural emphases, to solving one of the biggest problems that our civilization faces, which is how are we going to make sure that our oceans stay viable and healthy? Our well-being completely depends on this. So it just seems silly and self-defeating to not include that diversity. I would add to that I have experienced that it brings so much joy and fun to interact with people who come from all different kinds of backgrounds. And that's both racial and ethnic, accessibility differences, gender, all of that diversity. What I have done to advance that was I moved from a very comfortable endowed professorship at Dartmouth College to UC Santa Cruz when I was tapped on the shoulder and asked, would I be willing to come and direct this incredibly innovative graduate program in coastal science and policy, that is solution focused, but the faculty who designed it were really committed to also having it be highly diverse. So from the very first cohort, we've had high domestic diversity and international diversity. To date, we have students from 18 different nations have been in our program. We've had 71% diversity overall and about 24% of our students. And we have found that the two secrets to this are, having started with a very diverse first cohort, we saw that diversity attracts diversity. We've had so many applicants tell us they put our program first because they didn't want to be the minority in the room. And the second ingredient is not rocket science, providing sufficient funding for students to really support them adequately so that financial obstacles is not a barrier to having the best and the brightest join us, regardless of where they come from.
So, Anne, we have 2 minutes left, and I could see Mariana nodding her head. Mariana, would you like to say something?
Yes, I totally agree with Anne. I think we are part of the world. So why aren't we making the decisions as well? For me, it's as simple as this. I want as many people as diverse as possible making decisions and having their inputs on everything that is related to science, because we all live in here. I don't want to lead to people that are, it's not my part of my culture or my experience. I want to also generate an input. And I feel like one thing that we are doing to include everyone, at least from my project, is that our data is free to everyone. So if you are in Brazil and you don't have funding for research, you can use our data for free. It's there. It's the world's data, and you can use as much as you want. We also provide workshops.
I'm going to interrupt. Sorry, we have 1 minute left. I want to give all three of you a chance. Any last words for anybody aspiring to enter this field?
Reach out.
And Kelley, you get the first dibs out
you
here.
go first. You go first.
So my advice would be, at least from my personal experience is, I think it's really important to find that overlap between your natural talents and your passions, and I think success will come if you find that combination, you pursue that.
I'll add one more really briefly. Do not be afraid to reach out to really senior people who you admire and ask them for help and ask them to introduce you to people. Many of them would love to help young rising leaders.
I strongly agree with that. Mariana, a couple of words and then we're out.
I think from a very practical view, learn programming skills and work with big data sets, because we are creating a lot of data. There is a lot of information out there, and it's important to start learning how to deal with these data sets as early as possible.
So I'd like to say thank you to our wonderful panel for sharing what you're working on and sharing all your expertise with the audience. Thank you.
And thank you, Radhika, for moderating this. You did a great job.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to meet all of you.
Yes, thank you so much to the panel, to Radhika, Kelley, Mariana, and Anne for these wonderful insights on the current state of ocean research and new technologies for monitoring the ecosystem and strategies to harness wave energy. I especially appreciate Anne's observation on the fun that comes with working with diverse teams. So thank you for that and your personal reflections.